Hey, detoxers. Welcome to another episode of the Disinfo Detox with Professor of Political Science at University of Wisconsin, River Falls, Neil Kraus. Welcome to the Disinfo Detox.
Thanks very much for having me. Happy to be here.
Heck yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. We're talking about your book, The Fantasy Economy, Neoliberalism, Inequality, and the Education Reform Movement. I got to tell you, these are different strands I followed in my own work, and I've never seen them put together in such a succinct, understandable, and compelling way. So this is going to be fun. I want to get into what the fantasy economy is, but I think before we do that, it might help for folks out there who aren't seeped in the academic rhetoric here to kind of explain what is neoliberalism, what was its rise. I mean, I think most people obviously live in a neoliberal environment or are listening to this, but they may not know the term. So can you kind
Yeah,
of give a brief history of that?
yeah, for sure. Basically, neoliberalism is kind of the version of capitalism that exists in the United States, in the West. There's not like a firm date here, but I think most people trace it to really the '80s, the 1980s, late '70s, '80s, when we kind of evolved into kind of like this hyper capitalistic version of the economy. And the intellectual origins go back much further than that. You can read historians and others that talk about some of the economists, philosophers in the 40s and 50s. But really, the story I tell is even though I do go back prior to the 80s, it's mostly a Reagan up to the present kind of story. Um, and it's kind of just the air we breathe today in the economy and higher ed, um, where deregulation, minimal taxation, privatization, these things are just sort of the starting point. They're kind of taken for granted, and so there's really and also, of course, the real assault on labor unions that's been going on for decades. It's really kind of the corporate, you know, domination really of the economy. And that's kind of how I think about it. I don't necessarily love the term, even though it's in the subtitle of my book, but I do think we have to, delineate the last several decades of capitalism from what came the several decades before that. And so that's why I use the term.
Yeah, and I think right, it's important for listeners to know too that this, we think of the political parties always warring with each other, and at some level they are, but generally, and Mark Blythe talks a lot about this. There are these different, eras of shared ideology. So there's, a basic commitment to laissez-faire free market capitalism from the late 19th century till about the 1930s, when you get Keynes economics, where they say like, hey, government needs to be manage the economy to protect capitalism from capitalists. You get this crisis of the 70s, and that's when neoliberalism is introduced, where government and unions are the bad guy, and
Right.
we're going to get rid of all these supposed manufacturing jobs, which are largely union based, and replace them with everybody college educated expert class. And that this kind of where your book fits in, because you refer to, well, you tell me, what's the relationship between neoliberalism and the fantasy economy, and you can kind of explain what the fantasy economy is. That'd be great.
Yeah. Well, first, the fantasy economy is just a concept I came up with to describe what is largely a fictional version of the economy that's been advanced uh, really since the 70s and 80s, that's very much in the interests of corporations and the wealthy. And in this mythical version, um, there are all these high wage, high skilled jobs. There's always a shortage of skilled workers. The education system's always failing. And these things are just treated as articles of faith, these claims. Um, and when you look at the actual data, right, on the economy, and this is still, of course, true up to the present day, significant majority of jobs don't require any education beyond high school, and that's the reality. That's the real economy. That's the one we live in. And yet, back to your initial question, what's the relationship between neoliberalism and the fantasy economy? What I argue in the book is that neoliberalism, which we just sort of laid out a minute ago, what are the main kind of tenets or main ideas, main policies of neoliberalism, was never going to be popular with the American public, right? It was never going to be sort of a winning political program or policy program. In other words, I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and in upstate New York, of course, like the Midwest, much of the Northeast, and really much of the country actually was built on manufacturing, not just the Midwest and the Northeast. But you're not going to go to my hometown of Syracuse in the 1980s and say, we're going to ship all your jobs overseas, we're going to crush unions, we're going to lower taxes on corporations, we're going to do everything we can for the wealthiest, and we're not going to raise the minimum wage for decades. Please vote for us. I mean, that's not going to happen, right? So starting really with actually before A Nation at Risk, but A Nation at Risk, the report from '83 kind of ratcheted up the rhetoric of this information age, this knowledge economy that in which there are all these jobs, and the problem is always, always, always the education system was failing, right?
Can I just interject real quick, just for the audience? Nation at Risk was a 1983 report by the Reagan administration that basically argued the education system was failing the country, and conservatives kind of used that as a
Yeah,
pretext for dismantling education, public education.
yeah, absolutely, and it really became the narrative. I mean, I graduated from high school in 1986. I mean, it was just taken as a given that the education system was failing. Now, that report, of course, has been studied by a lot of scholars. I draw on a lot of them in my book. It's been debunked repeatedly. It's if you read it today, it's just laughable, right? But it created the narrative. It led to a narrative that created charter schools, created school choice, eventually created test-based accountability. And so we've been sort of trying to fight against that ever since. And in the last 10, 15 years, it's really been applied to higher ed. But so really, they, basically what corporate America did and policymakers, the Republican Party did this very, very openly and willingly. The Democratic Party eventually went along. They basically, shifted the whole discussion away from all the stuff that I talked about a minute ago, like shipping jobs overseas and destroying unions and not raising the minimum wage, and then always, always, always talking about the education system, right? Like always talking about us, and always making the debate, the discussion about economic opportunity solely about education, not about policy, not about what employers do, what business is doing. It's about your local English department, your local high school. That's what's determining your standard of living. That's why we're losing all the time. That's why education is on defense all the time, because we're not, we can't create jobs, we can't raise wages, we can't do any of that stuff, and we're blamed for people's economic problems by business. I mean, that's the gist of it, really.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating argument, and so I want to get into another aspect of it because anybody who's worked in higher ed, I think, will will certainly know what you're talking about. But to help us unpack this a little bit, the shift to neoliberalism at the kind of national level, I mean, like politicians start to see everything through this lens of market trumps public,
Yeah.
unions are wasteful, we need to appeal to experts in a managerial class and take power from faculty governance, we need to reduce students from learners to customers,
Hmm.
reduce faculty from full-time tenure track professionals to gig workers. All those kind of change the neoliberal lens changed what education is. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. I mean, it really kind of made education really about just job training, education itself, the purpose of job training. I mean, there's long been a debate, right, about the purpose of education, and you can go back 80, 100 years, and you can read stuff by business that talks about the need to create workers and stuff like that. But at the same time, education as an institution, including higher ed, was always right up until the 60s and 70s and kind of in the 80s it fell apart, always kind of seen as important for creating democratic citizens, right? For creating well-rounded people who are educated in a whole variety of fields, who get to choose if they want to major in sociology or chemistry or whatever. um, but that sort of model of education is really replaced by a model that makes it really only about job training, and for a very limited set of jobs at that, right? So so the whole notion of education for democracy, education for citizenship, for human growth, for just well-being, for all of these things, enlightenment, um, really becomes seen as quaint, as, oh yeah, that's how we used to think, that's how we used to talk, and that sort of thing. But we heard from the manager down the street who said that she can't find enough workers for her plant or whatever. Therefore, let's create a new major for them. I mean, that's kind of how the politics of higher ed goes for the last 20, 30 years, right? And
Yeah, and faculty, because I mean, there's a lot of blame on students. Say, like people, older generations love to blame young people for the
yeah,
condition of
yeah,
the world they didn't
yeah,
create. But I think faculty do play a critical role in that, right? I mean, there's perverse incentives for keeping employment in higher ed and being able to kind of write yourself as a candidate for a job who is someone who's conscious of the labor market and is going to train students for the future of that market. There's a lot of incentives in higher ed. That's how you get those jobs. Where if you're someone who comes out swinging about democracy and critiquing like the corporate influence on the university, you're probably getting thrown into the pile. So can
yeah.
you kind of talk about faculty on that?
Yeah, well, let me first, Nolan, defend faculty,
Okay.
uh, it, because now I get why not only administrators but faculty think and talk and act the way they do. Because I just, for the last 10 years, I been studying. So much of this stuff is targeted at us. It's targeted at higher ed. I mean, it's no accident that some of the major players in the book are at Columbia University, Georgetown, and so forth. I mean, foundations and corporations have known, and because they're very smart, they're very savvy politically, that if we can convince people in education that education is failing, end of story. We can go home. We're all done. And so, I mean, John Shelton, who's a good friend of mine, president of AFT Wisconsin, wrote a great book called The Education Myth. And John and I talk often about how oftentimes our hardest audience is actually in the academy, right? I mean, I talk to people in business all the time, and told them about my book, and, oh, what's it about? And I summarize it in a sentence or two, and they say, yeah, I guess there aren't very many good jobs, huh? I guess there aren't any guarantees if your kid gets a 4-year degree. It's like it's not a stretch for them, right?
Right.
And yet there's an awful lot of folks in the academy, and again, I'm defending them because this is all we've heard, right? It continues to be all we've heard, right? All we hear, rather. I read a piece in Inside Higher Ed the other day, and it reduces Trumpism and authoritarianism to, well, we didn't sell higher ed enough, right? We didn't promote our ability to lift people up economically. In other words, it doesn't address what's happening in the bigger system at all. It blames us, right? The whole gist of it was to blame, the piece was to blame higher ed for its own, problems now, right? So this is the whole ecosystem within which we exist. So so that's my kind of defense of why so many of our colleagues, I think, appear to be a little bit hesitant. And also my explanation as to why, as you said a moment ago, there's not a lot of voices very publicly or in a vocal sense critiquing the corporate takeover of the university and that sort of thing, because there are not incentives to do that. I mean, you're not going to advance at your local university, not at all. You'll be
Shunned.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So so I get that too, but I can't unsee what I've researched. I mean, I can't, and all the data that is misleading is a pretty, well, I'll just say it's misleading for and all these numbers that you know that I write about in the book. I mean, yeah, it was very troubling what I discovered, and yet it explained everything at the same time.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point in terms of education. I wonder somewhat about kind of the what's happened to the ideology of faculty over the years,
Yeah,
because you go 20 or 30 years of neoliberals controlling the institution, and that includes folks who control like the hiring processes. Like I've always said, how diverse is a diversity statement? Are they looking for a certain type of candidate out of that diversity statement? If so, it becomes a homogeneity statement. And then if they are, if we take that as true, and these are majority neoliberals on campuses in terms of faculty, those are folks I think who don't see the value in democracy. They don't see the
yeah.
value in labor unions, and it makes it difficult to organize and resist. So I think that's kind of where I see the issue with faculty is almost like an ignorance of their own power and kind of buying into the neoliberal framework. And there was a astounding example of this. The American Federation of Teachers has endorsed this partnership, which I know you're well aware of, with a lot of these big tech companies, basically to work with faculty to train on AI. And I and a handful of other voices found this ridiculous that labor unions and corporations are by definition the antithesis of one another. They should be in conflict. But we're in such a neoliberal era that it seems like many faculty didn't notice or didn't care. The president of the union, Randy Weingarten, her position is that she heard almost no pushback from it, and that's she doesn't think there's actual pushback amongst the membership. So, I mean, what do you think about that in terms of the ways in which neoliberalism has kind of transformed faculty and almost created a situation where faculty don't have many options to kind of resist the reduction in focus on things like civics and education?
Um, one of the things that stands out, as you talk, is that, and lately, it's funny. I wrote two books, and I never thought about language. And then I was about 51 or 2 years old, and I started actually thinking about words and language. And I wrote this book. Um, there is no other language in higher ed. There is no other data, than corporate language. I mean, all of our language, all of our assumptions, all of our data is all corporate language assumptions and data, right? But it's like, we're the analogy I like to use is that in higher ed, we're fish, right? And if you ask a fish, what is water? I'm just going to look at you. What are you talking about, right? I mean, like we don't like the no, like if you question, I have found this is, and all I did was look at federal data, which now, of course, will be non-existent or bogus, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I have found in higher ed, questioning the demographic cliff, it's like you might as well question the existence of God.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just unbelievable. I said, no, really, I don't know econometrics, but I can read federal projections and talk to a lot of people. They didn't even know they existed, right? There's so much in higher ed that, going back to the union example, I think that, which I'm of course active in. I'm vice president of AFT Wisconsin. I'm a proud member of AFT Wisconsin. I've written stuff for American Educator. I've written stuff for the AUP. They do great stuff. Um, if there, I can't say who was in the room or who did what. I know how it works in a typical higher ed institution. That there typically are not dissenting voices in the room. There are corporate salespeople and consultants, and they're the ones that basically tell our administrators and board members and university presidents what the issues are. They frame the issues. They say what the so-called crisis is. It's not a crisis of public funding. It's an enrollment crisis, right? Enrollment goes down 5%. It's an enrollment crisis. Public funding over decades has gone down 30-40%. It's not a public funding crisis. I mean, that's who they're listening to. I really hope that our union leaders are not simply listening to corporate salespeople, or, as you point out, should be on different sides. We have very different interests, obviously.
Great point. Now, this one may be a little more difficult question. I've been asking a couple folks. I don't even honestly know kind of where I stand on this one, so I promise it's not a loaded question.
Yeah.
Um, are we in a post neoliberal moment, and if so, what is that moment?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I just see what Trump is doing, and I've been writing some stuff recently, as being kind of neoliberalism on steroids. Um, and it seems like it's like a 19th century kind of version of capitalism. Um, Very much so. I mean, basically, what Trump is trying to do is repeal the 20th century, and the Supreme Court is allowing that to happen. Um, Very, very willingly, right? So I don't know what we are in. I mean, we're clearly in an authoritarian moment. There's no
Mhm.
question about that. And democracy by the day is eroding. Um, it's eroding very tangibly, and it's very, very troubling. And I've been writing about that as well. And I don't know if you're reading anyone, Nolan. If you are, please tell me. But I'm sick of Substacks, man. I mean, I'm tired of and I read a bunch of them, right? And I write a bunch of stuff myself, but I don't know what people are thinking. I mean, the plan is to what, regain the House next year. It's like the Democratic Party has missed the last 6 months, or the last 8 years, for that matter. I mean, I don't. Um, uh, yeah, so I don't know what. I don't know what it. I mean, it's not good what we're in. Democracy's falling apart by the day, but at the same time, I think it's just kind of the evolution, the extension of Reaganism, of hyper capitalism, if you want to call it hyper neoliberalism or whatever. That's kind of how I see it. But
Yeah, and because you are in political science, I feel comfortable asking this question. The you mentioned about the Democrats kind of seemingly forgetting the last 8 years, and I think at least for the last 20 or 30 years, both parties have really gotten comfortable on running on the other side is terrible. Let's replace them, not
yeah,
actual policies or changes. I think that's always why issues like immigration and abortion, they never actually wanted them settled because you could always get your base excited on both sides if it remains a question. Where now, the Democrats are the ones who aim to solve abortion and immigration's out there. Um, Democrats seem to be able to make that case in Trump 1.0 that, look, if we just get him out, Trumpism's dead, we'll get Biden in.
right.
I would argue, and I don't think any person on the left would disagree with me on this, that what that ultimately resulted in is the MAGA movement getting stronger and Trump 2.0 coming back way worse from a liberal perspective than even
Yeah,
1.0. So, yet it seems to me, and you tell me this with a question, as you're watching kind of the rhetoric and behavior of the Democratic Party, and this I don't mean the voters, I mean the actual like leaders of the party or elected officials. It seems to me they're getting comfortable back in this old like 1990s Democrat, which is like, let's chase the unicorn
yeah.
Republican centrist, the MAGA person who's on the fence. So if we just get enough of them, we'll win. One, do you see that? Two, do you have any faith in that working? And if not, three, what's some alternatives you propose for people out there who are saying like, look, I know the Democrats suck, but I'm looking for an answer here.
I mean, the Democratic Party seems to have thrown in the towel on uh, non-voters. Just not like, quite literally, not even bother trying to mobilize any traditional, non-voters. I mean, I teach, younger, voters for 25 years now, have taught. They're totally up for grabs, most of them. There are millions of them. um, Republican Party is so aggressive at going after younger voters in so many different settings. I don't see the Democratic Party doing that. I see the Democratic Party acting uh, as if we're still in kind of a state of normal politics here. That there'll be this, and they're talking about public opinion as if it still matters. And I've written a lot about public opinion. I'm a big supporter. I think democracy should, the government should reflect public opinion. I mean, so what? Everything the Trump administration is doing is very unpopular. And I
Yeah.
mean, what I mean, that's a given. Like, I can name 100 policies that were super popular that haven't been passed in decades. Um, from raising minimum wage to campaign finance to all this other stuff. I mean, it doesn't matter if you don't. I think the struggle in the Democratic Party, I don't think they have an overarching message. I mean, what I hear, and I hear this from Democratic Party officials, and I'm on the border of two states, so I hear folks, Democrats from both states. I mean, party people, Wisconsin and Minnesota, pretty regularly, and I don't think they have an overarching "this is what our party is about" kind of um, sentence or phrase or anything. Whereas the Republican Party has a story, has who are the villains here, and all the rest of it. And they've had it really since Reagan. And you know, government's terrible. Government, civil servants are lazy. Unions are horrible. Regulations are evil. They impede economic growth. End of story. Elect Republicans, right? And then they eventually, became the anti-abortion party and a bunch of other stuff. But um, I don't. It maybe be interested in what you think, but I don't hear anything coming from Democrats about like some overarching. This is what we're about, and this is what we're going to take to voters, and this is, um, I don't know. I'm still waiting to hear that. But
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think one of the legacies of neoliberalism, obviously, is that, and this really, I mean, it starts under Carter, but really goes off the rails with Clinton, is
yeah,
that
yeah,
the party opened itself up to corporate funding, and I think the Democrats who are in power now, a lot of them owe their funding to those big donors, and those big donors share, cultural aspects. They don't mind if their kid is trans or if they have a black coworker. In fact, they support it, but they really, pay for those Democrats to thwart any kind of leftist, material focused revolution, like a Bernie Sanders type insurgent, or AOC possibly, who wants to, actual redistribute wealth. That could actually hurt the material conditions of the wealthy. So I always see kind of wealthy liberals giving to the Democratic Party, less so than supporting policies per se, more about maintaining a culture and thwarting efforts at the redistribution of wealth for working people. And I
yeah,
think that is one fight the Democrats have obviously been fighting for decades. They haven't settled. And then the other one, I think, and I know they hate when I bring this up, but I mean, Gaza, I think, remains a major issue for that party, going into the election, about the United States relationship with Israel. And I think you see that in the Mamdani campaign and others. So I think those are the two things that Democrats are kind of dancing around. They're finding every excuse, right? Maybe it was Harris, maybe it was Biden, maybe we should have went on podcasts.
yeah, yeah. Right.
Like, maybe, Gavin Newsom, maybe we should have more social media feeds. They're
Yeah.
all these kind of like window dressing. And I think they're dancing around these like larger issues. But I don't know. That's my take. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think obviously foreign policy is relevant. I mean, I think that there's been progress on that within the party, but it's still a struggle internally. Um, I think that the Democrats' resistance to just I mean, I'm always listening for just the word corporation or corporate or any form of it
Yeah.
in anybody besides a speech by Bernie or AOC or four or five others, right? They just won't say it. They just won't say it, and the whole notion of, as you say, people's material well-being, is not front and center. And yet, if you look at the numbers, I mean, Michael Moore's been saying this kind of thing forever, really.
Mhm.
Um, there's a whole lot more of folks who are in favor of all these things than, who are very critical of corporate power. I mean, there's no heavy lifting if we criticize Elon Musk, if that's the whole thing, right? Or just billionaires, right? This is another one of my hangups. Like, I looked it up recently. It was like 88 billionaires in the United States, or some really. I mean, there's 340 million people in the country, right? I mean, the economy works really well for 5 to 10% of us, right? And this is not rocket science here, but yet they make it so challenging. Oh, another thing that strikes me too, as I thought about it as you're talking, you know, I'm sure you. Well, I'm not sure. Maybe you don't use profanity in your personal life. Maybe you never utter any words that you should not say. I maybe have done it once or twice, but like, if Gavin Newsom and others and Beto O'Rourke swear a lot, it's like that's okay. That's fun and all, but that's not going to do anything,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like the Dems. This is what strikes me is they will fight back, fight back. It's like. Um, okay, what's the agenda? What's the plan? What's our overarching philosophy? And how about starting our own fights, right? I mean, the fact that we're reacting to fights that are,
Mhm.
you know, we're getting punched and kicked and punched in the head over and over again. So we punch back and we celebrate. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like we need another discussion, another, a whole nother thing. But like higher ed, the Dems are always on defense. I guess they don't see it, because they're always on it. But yeah, I need some offense here, and I don't think swearing and that's I'm all for emotion and so on and so forth. But you need an agenda. You need some. You also need a story, and you need to connect with people, and that in and of itself is not going to do it, in my opinion. But.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of that little retreat that the Democrats threw a couple of months ago about they said they needed to understand men more. And so I
Yeah,
think they had some like wealthy retreat that I forget, it was some like high-end food in a high-end hotel. And it was just
yeah,
every sign of not trying to actually get out there and try to meet or understand, roughly 50% of the population.
right, right,
It's
right.
not like they're tough to find.
Even that, I mean, even just buying into that narrative is a corporate sort of thing. Like, oh yeah, our problem is a male problem, and if you look at all the numbers, I mean, Trump's numbers among black voters went up at just at the margins. It wasn't a little bit more with Hispanic voters. That's more of but that's a policy problem, right? That's an immigration policy problem. That's not just a rhetorical issue there. So yeah, I mean, I remember hearing that, and that's a big narrative on the right, that there's a problem with masculinity, and no, there's a jobs problem, there's an economics problem.
Exactly.
Just go to any town USA and look around and see the jobs that are there, and what they pay and what housing costs, and end of story. I mean, that's the problem.
All right. He is Neil Kraus, a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. And the book is The Fantasy Economy, Neoliberalism, Inequality, and the Education Reform Movement. Hey, Neil, where can folks go to get this book and follow more of your work?
I think the best place to go, of course, is my publisher, Temple University Press. I write a lot of stuff for Wisconsin news outlets. There's a great news organization called Tone Madison. I've got a forthcoming piece there. I've written a bunch of stuff it's called the Capital Times out of Madison. And I just wrote a piece actually for the AFT's national publication, American Educators. So yeah, places like that, and I'll continue to write on all these topics in the future.
All right. Well, we will certainly have you back on the program. It's been a pleasure. Everyone, I encourage you, check out the book, The Fantasy Economy, Neoliberalism, Inequality, and the Education Reform Movement. Neil, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely. And Detoxers, we'll see you next time.